Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk a little bit about one of the most famous book that Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, the most famous British economist, wrote. And its title is The Economic Consequences of Peace. And it's not a technical book about economics. It's famous because it was able to forecast the tragedy of how the Paris Peace Act, the Paris Treaty of 1919, after the First World War, and the consequences that it would have had on the German economy, then on the European economy, and most importantly, would have brought Europe to the Second World War. And it may sound crazy if you didn't know it. But yes, this man really was doubting. He was not forecasting a Second World War, but he was really saying that there in Paris, there were the fundamentals of a deep and violent crisis in Europe. So guys, let's get to this book, The Economic Consequences of Peace. I'm gonna review it a little bit, put it into context, analyzing it from international relations viewpoint in some points, and it's relevant also some international law points, and of course some economics. But let's get to it. So the book describes the negotiations of, basically, in theory, four leaders: the Italian Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, these ones were called Orlando and Lloyd George, and Clemenceau, President of France, and Wilson, President of the United States of America. The negotiations took place in the agreements for this treaty took place in Paris in 1818, right after the end of the First World War. The First World War started in a very ambiguous way that really few people were expecting. That taught a lot about bilateral agreements, bilateral defense agreements, not multilateral but just two states, because it this system, international law system, created a problem of ripple effects, basically, because when Austria declared war to Serbia, if it was just a war between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what would have been the problem, right? That's a bit, I don't want to sound bad to anyone, but it would have been limited to a very restricted place and to a much lower number of people. But then there was the problem of the alliance, because Russia was allied with Serbia and Germany was allied with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Russia said, do you really want to intervene? Because we have to defend Serbia. And the Germans said, well, we really have to defend the Austro-Hungarian Empire because we are allied. So it became a war between Germany and Russia, Russian Empire as well. And then, since France was allied with Russia and the UK was allied with France, it became really a war against of the UK, Russia, and France against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then Italy came in 1 year later against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It played a role in the sense that it was that really small way that kind of made a difference, some historians sustain. But let's get to the thing that, after all this complicated reasons why the war started, after the war, everybody wanted to blame, almost everybody, particularly under the pressure of Clemenceau. This is the key thing. Clemenceau, French president, puts a lot of pressure to punish Germany with the claim that it was Germany the reason of the First World War. Now, Germany declared war to France, okay? The fact is that there are really different people at this treaty. The three that counts are just everyone but the Italian, Orlando, Prime Minister, but particularly Clemenceau from one side and Woodrow Wilson on the other side. President of France against, basically. In terms of principles, in terms of views of history and the world and the future, they're very different. And in terms of international relations, we can interpret their relationship and their dialogue as realist Clemenceau against liberal Wilson. Almost, I would say, a classical liberal, because Wilson was really convinced, as Kant said, that a word of democracies would have brought toward peace. Clemenceau was a man that really lived in the past, that didn't believe that historical conflict between France and Germany would have ever stopped. And the only way to get that conflict finished was to finish one of those countries. And as Keynes outlines in his book, he really loved this country, really wanted France. He said he loved France as Pericles. I don't know if you call it Pericles, but as one of the most important rulers of Athens, ancient Greece, loved Athens. Just to say that it was really nationalist and patriotic. He really felt he had the responsibility to put his country as a powerful nation, to gain power, to have his country to gain power and relevance in Europe and in the colonies. And on the other side, we have Wilson. And Wilson has a very long perspective on the future. Wilson is a person that also doesn't have as long of a career in politics as Mr. Clemenceau. He just came, he lived his own life as an academician. He was a professor in university at Aberystwyth, and he taught international relations and political science. And he had this view, he wanted to found the Nation Society. So the precursor of the United Nations. The treaty had the purpose to undermine the three pillars of the German economy, to destroy them so that Germany had no possibilities of restarting economically. What Keynes criticizes about this Clemenceau pressure is that it's blind, it's completely blind about the future, because he doesn't see that if the German industry doesn't restart, even the whole Europe is not going to restart, including France. Okay, so this is an important economic concept. Clemenceau's view, according like every realist, is a mercantilist view, like Colbert, like all of those people that believe that the game of trade, it's a zero-sum game. So if there's a pie that is a 10-kilo pie, big pie, and you take half of it, the other people are gonna stay with half of it. And what economics actually demonstrate, and this might be like obvious, right? But what economics actually explained is that everyone gets their own slice, and they're gonna produce something with it. There's gonna be more than the initial weight of the same cake. Okay, so but Clemenceau believes that it's not true. Believes in what international relations theorists call and economists as well, of course, call relative gains. But what Keynes is asking for, and would like to see from Wilson, that is not able to put as much pressure as Clemenceau, also for his limited knowledge of the European situation. What he wants is these allied forces, France, the UK, the US, and Italy, to, for example, destroy the inter-allied debt. He wants them to destroy the inter-allied debt, so every debt they contracted with everyone else, and especially the most indebted countries were France and Italy, and they were especially indebted with the US. So Keynes is asking for what he calls the American kindness, because he thinks that if they don't bring to zero those debts, it's impossible for those economies to restart. But the real problem is the weight I was saying they were putting on Germany. They wanted to destroy German economy and its possibility to restart, so they wanted to eliminate, bring to zero, to the ground, the three pillars of its economy. So number one, steel and coal. They invaded Alsace and Lorraine. These are the French name of those two regions that today belong to France. And they invaded them and occupied them in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871. A war that they won. They came to Paris, and where they founded the German Empire, by the way. And it was really a shame that a cut in French people's art that they carried. They were very resentful for it, and of course the Germans made them very resentful, gave them any excuse to be resentful, and France wanted it back. Okay, and Wilson agreed with that, and Keynes is not sustaining that that's wrong or not. What he's saying is, since the problem is about carbon and steel, and especially when we're talking about Alsace and Lorraine, it's about carbon, it's that there are no more German skilled workers there, because for different reasons. Number one, they died. A lot of them died at war. Number two, a lot of the machinery is damaged, because those were places of war. And three, you can't have as much of skilled workers there as before. You need time to create those capabilities. And it might sound simple to do that job, but apparently it really wasn't, because those workers weren't as easily substituted as forecasted maybe by Clemenceau, if he ever thought about it. And the fourth problem was poverty. There was really not too much food to eat, and since workers had less to eat, they had less energy to work as efficiently as before. So it's a problem of efficiency and skills as much as it is about resources and movement of those goods. Why? Because they wanted to destroy as well the tariffs and transportation system. Well, about the transportation system, basically Germany has to give away most of its biggest trains, all of its biggest trains, and most of its smaller trains, and every boat, basically. And about tariffs, the third point I was making, tariffs and trade, and now I put second. But tariffs, they did this violence that actually was a minor one, but it really symbolizes how much they pushed against Germany after the war. a painful war. Okay, the whole book is about making the right decision when you're painful, because it's okay, you're painful, but try to reason, because maybe the damage you're making is bigger than the damage you had to pass through. Okay, so about tariffs, they did this thing. They imposed Germany They didn't allow Germany. Germany wasn't allowed at all to put any tariff of imported goods, but they had to pay tariffs to export their goods abroad. So they took away their sovereignty about tariffs and international trade. About the international trade, second point that I'm making now, they wanted to take away every possibility, I was saying, in transportation of ships and whatever they could carry. At the time, maybe it was ships. They were not big carriers, plane carriers. How do you say? Plane that could carry goods. Okay, so basically it was just ships, and they had to give away any ships, and it was really a victory for Great Britain in terms of the distribution of power in the international system, because historically it was Britain that dominated the seas, and the German economy, especially with Tirpitz as Minister of the Marine, Deutsche Marine, the British supremacy on world seas was in danger. So in terms of great power politics, this is an important point as well. And in terms of international trade, in terms of international law, there's an important point in this treaty that's the first time in history that this happens. They didn't just take away the richness and the goods that were ownership of the German state. They even took away everything from German citizens abroad. German citizens in Alsace and Lorraine, German citizens in the part of Poland and they gave to Poland, German ownerships and properties in the German colonies that were no German colonies anymore. They had to be split among other great powers, Great Britain and France. So this is important. This is an innovation in international law that I don't think it ever happened later. It was the first time in history it happened. And it was a great humiliation, of course, as everything else in this treaty regarding to Germany. There's another person that, regarding the protagonists of this treaty, peace treaty, that Keynes talked about. And it's at the time, his Prime Minister, Lloyd George. What is George Lloyd doing? As long as Keynes describes to us, it was not as important as the other two that I described to you, Clemenceau and Wilson. But at the same time, it played an important role because it didn't put any pullback force to Clemenceau craziness. And why? Because he had an election that he decided to get his people to vote before the term, and he wanted to get a treaty that people were happy about, so that he could win again the elections, and he could say he played the part of the tough guy. Everyone wanted to be the tough guy, except for Wilson. Wilson as well had some problems in interior politics, by the way. It was a midterm election, if I'm not wrong, that he needed to win, his majority to win, and that question about Europe wasn't really popular in the U.S. It was just the First World War was just the first intervention that the U.S. did in the European scenario, in the European theater, and they were isolationists. That their really essence, what George Washington said, is stay out of treaties that bond you to any country to enter in war with them. What would have been very helpful for European countries if they followed that advice. But so that was the role of Lloyd George. And guys, so I hope this video makes a little bit of clarity on these books, or teaches you something. If you have any doubts, write in the comments. I will read it and try and answer. So what this book really teaches is, when you lost, when you won, when you half won, when you half lost, wait a second. Because history is a chain of events. What you're doing today is going to have consequences in a long time. And the more important those moments are, the less conclusive they are. People think, okay, we closed the chapter in the conflict. The mistake they did is they thought they closed the chapter in the conflict between Germany and France. Laughable. Second World War, 1939. So they didn't. They actually, and that's Keynes' thesis that now it's easy to agree with, of course, is that they laid the foundations for the Second World War. There. Why? Well, think about Monaco's conference, okay? Everybody, Chamberlain first, was kind of, they felt responsible to allow Germany to continue its annexation, first of Austria, then of Czechia, and all of those parts, because they said, we put too much pressure in 1918, 20 years before, on Germany. Now what can we do? We should understand that maybe they felt that they made a mistake. Their predecessors made a mistake. And they put a lot of pressure. Too much pressure. They killed that economy. They kept those people poor. And they didn't listen to the Committee of Germany. Now, I'm not saying those people were stupid. They caused 73 million people in the Second World War. But of course, as Keynes says, they were blind. They didn't think at what was going to happen. And in case of Clemenceau and in Wilson's case, they didn't push hard enough, and they didn't know Europe. It says about Wilson, they didn't know Europe's situation well enough to make sure that peace would be possible. And remember, Keynes' thesis is this: European peace is possible if Europe can grow economically and be economically wealthy and stable. And in the European economy will be wealthy and growing and stable if the German economy would be healthy, grow and be stable. And why? Because it's an engine that it has not been substituted by any other country in Europe, even afterwards. So it's a book that really can teach a lot about that moment, those 40 years of history, First World War, Second World War, and everything in between, but actually about any similar moments and comparison we can make in history. It's very useful. Don't ever put it on a pedestal like absolute, always truth. History doesn't always repeats itself, but never exactly repeats itself. So we should be careful about using the teaching of the past, even if they reveal to be right. But this is an important book to understand history more.